Peter Lampel is the son of an Austrian refugee. He went to grammar school and then on to Oxford to study physical chemistry. He had a career in business and finance, mainly in the United States, and then returned to the United Kingdom. He founded and funded the Sutton Trust and is probably now one of this country's best-known educational philanthropists. Peter, the fact that you are the son of a refugee who had to make it for himself, what kind of impact has that had on what you've done since then?
Well, we grew up in very poor circumstances because my father came over before the war, and then after the war, he'd left Austria as a schoolboy. He basically supported the family and got qualifications at night school. So, for the first 11 years, we lived in Yorkshire. I grew up in Wakefield, went to school there, and then I guess my father was upwardly mobile and he got a job in Surrey, and I ended up going to grammar school in Reigate. And then when I was 17, at the end of my first year 6, my father got a job in Cheltenham. We moved to Cheltenham. I ended up at Cheltenham Grammar School. And it's very interesting because I think if I'd have stayed in Yorkshire, I mean, I kept up with some of my friends from Yorkshire. Most of them left school at 16. So I probably wouldn't have gone to university. Then when I went to Reigate, it was... if you did well, you were expected to stay on into the sixth form and go on to university. So I was certainly bound for university. But it's interesting, when I got to Cheltenham, if you did well, you were expected to apply for either Oxford or Cambridge. So it sort of brought home to me that I was the same boy with the same abilities. But because I kept moving locations, my whole aspirations changed.
But presumably that was because the type of pupil that you found in each of your schools in Wakefield, Reigate and Cheltenham
it wasn't my parents. It was pupils I mixed with, but it was also the teachers. The teachers had much higher aspirations in these different kinds of schools.
Is this sort of a north-south split, or is it a social class schools that have got more middle-class children than less affluent children difference?
I mean, obviously, where I grew up in Wakefield was more or less a working class area. I don't think it's a north class. I think it's more of a class
it's a social class thing.
And then we moved into into a nice detached house in Surrey. I was in a different environment. So I really appreciate the importance of aspirations and raising aspirations for kids.
But would you say that your ambition, your determination to do well, it came as much from school as it did your parents?
My aspirations came from the schools I was at. They pulled me through. It wasn't my parents pushing me at all.
And then you did go to Oxford. Did you experience this feeling different, feeling as though you didn't fit or not?
Not at all, because we looked at some numbers, and when I was there, 2/3 of the student body were from state schools, and when I set up the trust, it had dropped to 46%. So Oxford was a much more diverse place in the late 60s than it is today.
You went to Oxford at that time when grammar schools, set up after the war or taking children from wider social backgrounds after the war. There was a surge of students like that going to Oxbridge in a way that doesn't happen at the moment.
At that time, we had the direct grant scheme, which were actually private day schools that were most of them called grammar schools. I went to one, Reigate Grammar School, which were actually private schools that were state-funded, and they were effectively part of the state system and were classified as state schools.
Right. Okay, so your next 20 years or so, you spent quite a lot of time in the States.
Yes. I'd set up my own business in New York, and we'd open an office in London and in Germany, so that had gone very well. And I was very lucky to make some money, and I'd gotten bored with business and making money, so I was looking for something else to do.
Was it a deliberate decision, or were you sat here and think, well, I don't have to earn at the moment, I'm not sure what I want to do?
Well,
did you
exactly.
come back to England to be a philanthropist?
No, I really came back, but the reason I moved back is actually I got married to someone who was living in London, so I came back because of that, and we also had an office here, so I moved essentially from New York to London. And I just decided I wanted to do something helpful. It wasn't a big thing. And the first thing I did was, after the Dunblane massacre, I got in touch with people who were organising a campaign to ban handguns. And I mean, it was the most moving thing, because a couple of days later, there a father of a little girl who'd been killed at Dunblane was sitting in my living room, and the father of a little girl who had been killed at Hungerford, which was a massacre earlier, showed up in my living room.
Both in the 90s, yes.
Yeah, and it was so moving. I just said to them, look, I'll fund whatever you need, but I want to do it on an anonymous basis, which I did. And as you know, that was a huge success. We had a free vote in the House of Commons.
Right. And about 97, 98,
yeah,
I think.
exactly. So that got me a taste for philanthropy.
Yes. Yeah. But you then, I mean, since then, you've worked predominantly in education.
Yeah,
so
almost exclusively, yeah.
Having sort of had a taste of philanthropy and realised the influence you could have, why then start the Sutton Trust in education?
Well, I was gone for 20 years, Estelle, and it just became apparent to me when I came back that there was this feeling in the late 60s when I was coming through the system here that, things were changing, things were opening up. And it seemed to me, coming back 20 years or so later, that things had gone the other way, that things actually were closing up. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, I went back to my old school, Reigate Grammar School. All the places were free when I was there. It was now 100% fee paying. So a lot of kids, probably myself included, who were there, wouldn't be going there. I went back to my college at Oxford. When I was there, there were loads of kids from South Wales, working class kids there. Virtually none anymore. I mean, the whole mix had changed. So it was just seeing these things. Most of my friends who were state educated were sending their kids to private schools. I said, what is going on here?
But one of the things the Sutton Trust has actually done is that it's very good at gathering evidence. What you do is deeply rooted in a lot of statistical research. So, and some of it's quite frightening. I mean, of the research that you've done, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, I think probably the most interesting and influential piece of research we've done was funding the London School of Economics to look at social mobility. What's happened to social mobility in Britain? And they basically showed that actually over the last 30 years or so, social mobility has actually declined. I mean, the opportunities to move up for ordinary kids and less privileged kids have gone down. Kids born in the 50s had more chance than kids born in the early 70s of making it up the ladder. So that, I think that's very disturbing. And the other thing that's really disturbing, Estelle, is that we have, if you look at international comparisons for advanced countries, the absolute level of mobility in this country is actually the lowest of any advanced country. So that's what really drives me. And you've talked about the trust, but our whole focus is to try and improve social mobility through education, because there are lots of reasons for low social mobility and declining mobility, but education is a key one.
Two things strike me when it's looking at your statistics, and I suppose this is the debate the nation has. There's an argument which I think you might use eventually in this discussion, that the quality of education that children from less affluent backgrounds receive sometimes isn't as good as perhaps the best independent school.
Sure.
But also that even when they get the results, they don't get into the universities.
Yeah. We published a report very recently, actually, 3 or 4 months ago, which showed that there are 200 schools that account for 50% of the entry to Oxford and Cambridge, and a third of the entry to the top dozen ranked universities. So it's very concentrated in few schools. And we showed that it's not just based on A-level performance, that these schools actually get far more places than they should based on their performance. And there are thousands of comprehensives and sixth form colleges that kids are getting very good results, but aren't, for whatever reason, aren't getting into the top universities. So
is that they don't apply, or is it that the universities have a connection with certain schools and it serves them well to
I don't think there's
that?
any skullduggery going on here from the universities. We're doing much more work on this, but I think the main reason is that they don't apply. And then why don't they apply? Well, first of all, we've got this very strange system where you have to apply before you know your results.
Yes.
And obviously, if you're at a good state school or an independent school, that's not an issue. But if you're in a comprehensive and you're maybe the only pupil who's in that position, it's very difficult. Then we've got the whole, the aspirations and perceptions, and we have actually surveyed, 800 teachers who are responsible for advising children on where to go next, on why this is. And the short answer is that the teachers think the children are not confident about getting in, and even if they do get in, that they won't fit in. So there's a real perception issue of confidence. There's a big job to be done to change that.
I think what you're delving at really, it's this unanswered question of why as a country we've not really found a way of teaching children from all backgrounds to achieve their potential. I don't buy this thing that it's because they go to bad schools. It's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is more complicated. I think what happens in this country, and I mean the international research on this is pretty devastating, is that children who come from poor backgrounds are, you know, a year behind more affluent children by the time they're 3 and 4.
That's right, yeah.
And then they end up actually in primary schools that are in poor areas, and it may not be the school's fault, but if you get a whole mass of children from poorer backgrounds, that creates some problems. We have this very socially selective school system. That's the real problem. I mean, there's some research that says 50-something advanced countries, we have the closest correlation between children's performance and parental background of any country. And you know, unpicking that is really an enormous challenge.
And what your research shows, and is a cause for concern both politically and education, is that to some extent we've replaced selection by 11 plus or by exam to selection by house
Social
prices.
class, yeah.
So let's look at some of the things the Sutton Trust has
Sure.
done.
The first thing I did, I looked at the situation at Oxford, because that's where I'd been at university, and I approached the university with the idea of saying, look, you've got 46% of your children come from state schools, 93% of children come from are at state schools, 2/3 of the top performers at A-level are in state schools. Why are you 46%? Their answer was, well, we can't do anything about it because they don't apply to us. And I said, well, wouldn't it be good if you tried to get them to apply to you? And I was familiar with summer schools that American universities offer, so I approached them and said, look, I will fund a summer school if you will run it. So we got 64 children up to Oxford from schools they'd never heard from, first Oxford summer school, and 16 of these children ended up getting in. So
in that first year, from
in
the
that first year,
semester.
16
incredible.
of them ended up getting in,
Yeah.
and these were all new students.
Yes.
So that's what really got me started in terms of education.
And now how many universities are part of the summer school scheme?
Well, our scheme, we've got about a dozen, but more importantly, the government has taken on the summer school scheme, which was actually when you were in education. Yeah. And summer schools are now offered at the majority of British universities, so it's become actually quite a universal scheme, which was based on our original model. Yeah.
I mean, you must have followed that through because you're very good at evaluating your projects. You talked about the success of 16 getting in the first summer school. Yeah. What does it look like now?
We're up to something like 10,000 students have been through our summer school specifically. And we're looking at something like between 25 and 30% are offered places by the university where they were at summer school, which I think is a tremendous achievement. Yeah.